Good evening. My name is James Manyika. I'm a trustee of the World Affairs Council and your moderator for this evening. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest. Professor Peter Henry is the Dean of the New York University's Leonard Stern School of Business. He's the youngest person to hold the position, and he assumed the deanship in January 2010 and joined the Stern faculty as the William Berkeley Professor of Economics and Finance. An expert on the global economy, Peter Henry led the External Economic Advisory Group for the then Senator Barack Obama in his presidential campaign in 2008. Following the election, Professor Henry was chosen to lead the president's transition team's review of the international lending agencies, including the IMF and the World Bank. In 2009, President Obama appointed him to the President's Commission on White House Fellowships. He is the author of numerous articles and book chapters. Professor Henry is also best known for a series of publications in 3 flagship journals of the American Economic Association that overturn conventional wisdom on the topics of debt relief, international capital flows, and the role of institutions in economic growth. His first book, Turnaround, Third World Lessons for First World Growth, directly addresses such issues as economic efficiency as well as matters of international relations. Well, that was an introduction of Professor Peter Henry. Now the personal Pete Henry. Pete is the only economics professor that I know who can actually dunk a basketball. And in fact, he was once a finalist for a slam dunk competition. And Pete's also an old friend. In fact, we were Rhodes Scholars at Oxford together about 18 years ago. So it's my distinct pleasure to be able to welcome Pete Henry to the World Affairs Council. Pete?
Thank you, James. And I noticed that emphasis on old. Most of my dunking these days involves coffee and donuts, but that is as it should be in the cycle of things. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're at a very important moment in the world economy, and if we think about where we are, and think about where we are relative to what are known as really the flush years from 2002 to 2007, the world economy grew at a record rate. It grew at the fastest rate we've known since the collection of modern GDP statistics. Between 2002 and 2007, the world economy grew at a rate of 4.9%. As we know, the fastest rate of growth, if we disaggregate that world rate of growth, was amongst the emerging economies of the world. They grew at somewhere close to 6%, with the advanced nations growing something just below 3%. So emerging economies are driving global growth. But we find ourselves now in a very different position in some respects. Emerging economies are still driving global growth, but global growth is certainly not what it was between 2002 and 2007. Statistics from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, tell us that last year, emerging economies continued to grow at a rapid clip, about 5.3%. The advanced nations of the world grew at only 1.3%. And amongst the advanced nations, Europe contracted last year. So Europe remains in recession. So to put that in context, what does that really mean? Well, at 1.3% growth for the advanced nations are growing below what's called the trend rate of output. Why does that matter? It matters because it matters for jobs. When countries grow below their growth rate of potential, their potential growth rate, they don't grow fast enough to create jobs. So that is the backdrop. And the question is, how do we have a more prosperous future? And Turnaround really is a story of what we all need to do to have greater prosperity. How do we all win? And if we think about it, the first world nations, the advanced nations, the countries of Western Europe, the United States, Japan, in many ways resemble the third world, places where James and I come from, 3.5 decades ago. High debt, slow growth, and a lack of direction. And in turnaround, I make the very simple point that formerly third world nations turned themselves around and became today's emerging markets that are driving global growth through the application of three key principles. Three key principles that I'll describe in some detail later in my remarks. But first, I want to just give you a quick top-line sense of what those principles are. First, discipline. Discipline doesn't mean fiscal austerity. Discipline means sustained commitment to a pragmatic growth strategy that is both vigilant and flexible, and that values what's good for the country as a whole over what's good for any individual, interest group, person running for political office, etc. That's discipline. Second point, clarity. Third world countries, those third world countries that turned themselves around did so when their leaders demonstrated a clear commitment to a change of direction. And I'll illustrate clarity through a story from a very small country by the name of Barbados. The third point is trust. We live in a moment in which citizens don't trust their governments. Business, in many places, is quite skeptical of government. And emerging market governments are mistrustful of advanced nations' governments. So for as much discussion as there is at present about fiscal deficits, in the book I argue that what I call the trust deficit, and in particular the trust deficit between emerging nations and first world nations, is a key obstacle to shared prosperity in the future. So that's the very top line message, and I will share some stories to illustrate those 3 points in some detail. But I think it's useful because macroeconomics, to get some perspective, because macroeconomics, GDP growth numbers are ultimately about people. This is why we care about macroeconomics. So I want to share with you a short passage from Turnaround that I believe provides the proper context for the rest of our discussion here this evening. Growing up as a little boy on the island of Jamaica in the early 1970s, I cherished the time I spent on the porch of my grandmother's simple two-bedroom ranch house in Kingston, the nation's capital. There, at 3 Windy Way in Harborview, a middle and working class neighborhood at the southern edge of the city, I would sit on the brown speckled tile, leafing through the pages of Encyclopedia Britannica, reading Bible stories, and poring over back issues of National Geographic for hours on end. As sea breezes stirred the needles of the casuarina trees that lined the front yard and shaded my world from both the sun and the gazes of people passing by on the sidewalk, scents from Grandma's kitchen, pumpkin soup, baking bread, brown sugar, and lime juice wafted through the air. Things only got better as the day progressed, and the sun made its arc through the cobalt expanse of the Jamaican afternoon sky. The approach of evening was always my favorite stretch of time, a welcome pause between the heat of day and the fall of darkness. Grandma, finished with her cooking and housework, would come outside and sit with me in the early evening air. Encouraging children to read and dream was what Grandma, a former schoolteacher, did best. And she never missed an opportunity to work with one of her favorite students. Sitting together in the fading light, we lost ourselves in conversation. Accompanied by the pulse of chirping crickets, the reverberating reggae beats from a nearby rum shop, and the animated voices of young men playing soccer in the street. These are the sounds of the Caribbean, the lyrical backdrop to Grandma's outdoor classroom, where I asked question after question about the people and places I had encountered in the day's reading, and my ever-patient teacher shared with me facts and figures about distant lands. Yet the greatest lesson I learned from my grandmother came not from something she read to me, but from something she did for someone else. In Jamaica, as in many developing countries, poverty is never far away. On one occasion, the ambient sounds of those Caribbean evenings gave way to the piercing call of a woman at the front gate. Mrs. Henry, Mrs. Henry, you deso? Me beg you, make me come in. When poverty calls to you from the gate, you have to make a choice. You can avert your eyes, perhaps even turn your back and harden your resolve not to engage. But poverty will still be there looking at you, even if you don't have the courage to return its gaze. Soon come, Grandma called out as she lifted her tiny, slightly hunched frame from the chair next to me, walked across the tiles, stepped from porch to carport, and made the 30-foot journey to the gate. Good evening, Miss Mama. How are you? Miss Mama's appearance belied her reply. Me all right so far, Mrs. Henry. Miss Mama looked anything but all right to me as I watched her follow Grandma toward the porch. The closer Miss Mama came to my sacred classroom, the sharper the contrast I discerned between her and my beloved tutor. With bare feet, tattered clothes, matted hair, and a protruding belly seemingly at odds with her thin frame, Miss Mama appeared to be from an entirely different planet than my grandmother, who, with her pressed and starched cotton dress and neatly groomed appearance, was the quintessential schoolteacher and matron of the Anglican Church. After inviting Miss Mama to sit down next to her and across from me, Grandma asked Miss Mama if she was hungry. Miss Mama replied, "Yes, Mrs. Henry. Is long time me not eat, you know, ma'am." My grandmother disappeared inside, then emerged a few minutes later with a large tumbler of milk and a plate of warm, hard dough bread dripping with butter. I sat there, watching Miss Mama eat and listening to the exchange. My grandmother asking questions in the Queen's English, Miss Mama responding in patois. They continued on for some time, Miss Mama chronicling her tough circumstances, my grandmother offering words of comfort and encouragement, until the last crumbs disappeared from the plate, the milk was drained, and my grandmother sent Miss Mama on her way with the familiar Jamaican benediction. Walk good. I don't know how Miss Mama got her name, and I don't know where she came from, but I can picture her today just as I saw her in the first encounter in late 1977 when I was 8 years old. Over the next several months, Miss Mama appeared at my grandmother's front gate with increasing frequency. One day in 1978, following what turned out to be the last time I saw Miss Mama, I asked my grandmother, "Grandma, Miss Mama has a big belly, so why is she always hungry?" My grandmother replied that some people have big bellies not from eating too much, but because they never get enough to eat. For me, economics is all about Miss Mama. I was drawn to the subject because I wanted to help people in developing countries like my native Jamaica help themselves. Feeding the hungry is an act of kindness. Providing the hungry with the means to feed themselves is an act of empowerment that confers dignity as well as nourishment. My grandmother was too old and lacked the technical training to give people like Miss Mama that kind of enabling assistance. I wrote this book because I have no such excuse. Helping people to help themselves begins with a simple observation. Never in the history of the world has a country sustainably reduced poverty without significantly increasing its population's average overall standard of living. The gains from economic expansion may not be evenly distributed, so growth alone is not a sufficient condition for development, but it is absolutely necessary. Without growth, life becomes a series of zero-sum struggles directed at preserving one's share of limited resources. With growth, the pie expands, and the politics of distribution no longer involves such stark trade-offs. Because economic expansion provides the most reliable means of enabling the poor to lift themselves out of poverty, the critical question is, what kinds of economic policies lay the foundation for growth? The economic policy decisions implemented in the months and years ahead will determine whether people eat or starve, live or die, and not just in emerging economies. The financial crisis of 2008-2009 drove record numbers of people in the United States into unemployment, foreclosure, and poverty, to say nothing of the devastating impact of its aftershocks on the economies and people of Europe. Whether in the first world or the third, there is no place to hide from the power of policy. Policy. There's a fierce policy debate about fiscal soundness, fiscal austerity. The debate over fiscal austerity and what it means, or fiscal discipline, I should say, fiscal discipline and what it means didn't start in the United States, it didn't start in Europe. 7 years after that last sighting I had of Miss Mama, in 1985, in Seoul, South Korea, then Secretary of the Treasury, James A. Baker III, Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, James A. Baker III, made a very important speech at the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF in Seoul, South Korea. The world was in the midst of what was known as the Third World Debt Crisis, which had started 3 years earlier in 1982 in Mexico, on August 12th of 1982, declared that it could no longer service its debt. A number of countries followed suit, and the world found itself on the brink of a crisis that threatened the world's financial system because of big borrowers like Mexico, Brazil, and others. And so James Baker, Secretary Baker, went to Seoul, South Korea on behalf of his boss, President Ronald Reagan, to make a speech entitled The Program for Sustained Growth. The Program for Sustained Growth was a view about what the third world needed to do to begin growing again and to get out of the debt crisis. Baker went through a list of roughly 10 ideas about economic policy reform that came to be known as the Washington Consensus. The list of ideas, the list of policy reforms that Washington, meaning the IMF, the World Bank, and the United States Treasury felt that the third world needed to do to grow. And at the very top of that list was the idea of fiscal discipline. So as I said at the outset, if we look at the history of the third world struggle with economic reform, we learn that discipline doesn't mean austerity. Very specifically, if we look at the history of the third world's implementation of fiscal austerity, we learned something very specific. I looked at 81 episodes in Turnaround, on the research on which Turnaround is based, of countries' attempts to implement fiscal austerity. And what we learned is the following. In the 25 episodes when developing countries implemented fiscal austerity in the midst of high inflation, so think about Brazil or Argentina in the 1980s, fiscal austerity in the midst of high inflation creates economic value. That's not my view, that's the stock market's view. The stock market in these countries, when governments implement fiscal austerity in the midst of high inflation, the stock market reacts very positively, increases by about 60% in anticipation of programs aimed at cutting off inflation at the pass, so to speak. So fiscal austerity is appropriate in the midst of high inflation. What about when inflation is not so high? And I should define what I mean by high. In the context of emerging markets, the threshold is about 40%. So below 40% in what's called moderate inflation by economists who've studied inflation, 56 episodes. When emerging economies have implemented fiscal austerity in the midst of moderate inflation, 40% or below, the stock market responds very negatively. And I should also say that the behavior of more traditional economic indicators like growth and the subsequent fall in inflation confirms the stock market's view that fiscal austerity aimed at moderate inflation is not a value-creating proposition. So what does this mean for the United States and Europe, where inflation is 2 or 3%? Fiscal austerity is a wrong-headed policy approach. The world needs, particularly at this time, less austerity and more reform. Discipline means, in the context of fiscal policy, means a sustained commitment to sustainable finances in the long term with flexibility about the speed with which you reduce the deficit. And really understanding fiscal discipline in the context of both third world and first world countries really is no more complicated than the story of the ant and the grasshopper in Aesop's fable. And I want to give two specific examples, the United States and Chile. Let's contrast the two countries. The United States, in this case, is the first world grasshopper, if you will. In 2001, we had a record fiscal surplus, $236 billion. We know how that story ends. We decided to give that surplus back in the form of tax cuts. And let me just make the point, this is not a partisan point. One might make the case that had we had a different administration in 2001, had we had a Gore administration rather than a Bush administration, that surplus may have gone away in the form of higher spending. So it's not a partisan point. But the point is, by not saving when times were flush, when we were hit with shocks later, we didn't have the cushion that we needed. And therefore, we're in the situation we are now. Chile, in contrast, third world ant. In 2008, Chile was benefiting from the boom in commodity prices, copper in particular. The treasury was flush with revenue. The people of Chile burned Finance Minister Andre Velasco in effigy in the streets in protest, saying, essentially, give the people their money. Give us our money. Velasco said, no, this is money for a rainy day. Held his ground. When the financial crisis hit, Chile was able to implement a $4 billion tax cut package to cushion the blow. That's discipline. The second point I mentioned at the outset was clarity. I mentioned the tiny island of Barbados. Countries are able to turn themselves around when leaders demonstrate a clear commitment to a change of direction. In 1992, Barbados, a country that most people only think of as a place where you go for vacation, 250,000 people, small island, but big lessons. In 1992, Barbados was on the brink of a severe financial crisis, about to run out of foreign exchange reserves. The International Monetary Fund goes to Barbados and recommends that Barbados, which had a fixed exchange rate at the time, 1.7 Barbadian dollars to the US dollar, recommended that Barbados devalue the currency because much of Southern Europe today, the country had grown uncompetitive. A fixed exchange rate, rapidly rising wages rising more quickly than productivity, raised unit labor costs, and uncompetitive environment. So the way you traditionally deal with this problem is by devaluing your currency, because by devaluing your currency, what do? You effectively cut people's wages without consenting with them. The leadership in Barbados said, no, we don't want to go that route. We don't like the idea of a wage cut without consent. We don't like the idea of devaluation. And so instead, Prime Minister Erskine Sandiford convened three-party talks between the government of Barbados, the labor unions, and employers in the private sector. The details are in the book, but quickly, the government proposed a 9% wage cut. To put it mildly, the workers were not thrilled with this proposition, 30,000 people took to the streets of Bridgetown to protest. To put it in context, that's an eighth of the population. That's roughly the equivalent of 80 million people marching on Washington in protest of government policy. To his credit, the head of the labor union, Sir Leroy Trotman, realized this was putting the country at danger, could pull the country apart, changed his position and said, no, in fact, a wage cut is in fact what we need to restore competitiveness. Everyone has to share in this. They reconvened talks. The employers opened the books to the unions and agreed to share future productivity gains. So future wage increases were going to be tied to productivity gains so as not to let costs get out of line with productivity. Barbados was able to hold the center. They didn't devalue the currency. They cut wages by 9%. A year later, the economy recovered. For his troubles, Prime Minister Standiford and his party kicked out of office for 14 years. When asked, in retrospect, would you do it again? Prime Minister Standiford, and I'm paraphrasing here, said, the price that I paid was a small price to save the country. That's clarity. Discipline and clarity together produce trust. But as I said at the outset of my remarks, we currently suffer from a trust deficit. And I want to focus my last few minutes of remarks here on the trust deficit that exists between the third world, or the former third world, the emerging nations, and the first world. So I gave examples from two small countries, Chile and Barbados, both former third world countries, now emerging markets. Let's talk for a moment about large emerging markets, the BRICS, Brazil, South Africa, India, and so on. The BRICS account for 21% of global GDP. Through a combination of disciplined policies, and I want to emphasize this, a subset of market-friendly reforms that were appropriate for the local context because every country is different, and given the political cost, the difficulty of pushing through reforms that are appropriate, even appropriate for a given country, pushing through those reforms that provide the maximum bang for the buck is what's critical. So through such a pragmatic approach, the BRIC countries have risen to their current state. And yet in spite of this turnaround, 21% of global GDP, they only account for 11.5% of the votes at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, key institutions in setting the international economic policy agenda. So we have a situation in which there's a lack of reciprocity, a lack of recognition of the critical role that these countries occupy, and a lack of recognition of the ways in which they have, in fact, adopted the lessons that the first world, starting with James Baker, but even before that, preached and taught, and are now in a position, frankly, for the first world to learn from. Still have not been recognized for that. Other examples of what I call this lack of trust, or policies that undermine trust between the first world and emerging nations. At the onset of the financial crisis, everyone knew that global trade was the key, one of the keys, to maintaining prosperity. And so leaders stood up and said, we are going to affirm our commitment to maintaining open markets because global trade, imports and exports are critical to future prosperity and our continued prosperity. In spite of that declaration, between November 2008 and November 2010, according to the Global Trade Alert, there were 800 instances of protectionist measures implemented. More than 40% of those measures were implemented by G7 countries. Last example that I'll give. Oh, and by the way, I should have mentioned earlier, in the context of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, the countries of the Eurozone account for roughly 24% of global GDP, 32% of the votes. So they have an outsized share as opposed to the undersized share that the large emerging economies hold. During the height of the financial crisis, the International Monetary Fund actually took some steps to bridge this trust deficit and implemented a new lending facility called the Flexible Credit Line. The Flexible Credit Line was designed to allow emerging markets that had followed sound economic policy to have access to quick credit during a time in which credit was drying up all over the world. But largely as a result of not any one thing, but an accumulation of fiscal policy that advocated austerity in 1997 during the Asian financial crisis, the lack of reciprocity, voting shares, call it a history of tension and lack of reciprocity between the IMF and the emerging world. Not a single country availed itself of the flexible credit line during this critical period of the financial crisis. It is very hard to be a lender of last resort when people won't come to you for money. So all of these are examples of what I call the trust deficit. The trust deficit matters because, frankly, as I said at the outset, emerging markets are growing more rapidly than the world as a whole. We need emerging markets to continue to grow and to continue down the disciplined path that they've shown, in many cases, the first world, what they need to do in order to get back on track. And so we need emerging economies to continue to grow, to continue to implement the kinds of reforms that have allowed themselves to turn around so that they can pull us along as we get out of this financially induced slowdown in growth. And their ability, the ability of leaders in these emerging nations to, if you will, forgive the crass term, sell their electorate on the benefits of continuing down this road when the advanced nations say, do as we say, not as we do. We're making it harder than it needs to be. So, in closing, we all win or we all lose. There's a chance for shared prosperity. And if we will only, in the advanced nations, have the humility to observe the lessons that the third world, much of the third world, because there's still much work to do in the emerging world. But if we'll take those lessons that are there for the taking through the history of 3.5 decades of struggle with economic reform, there is a more prosperous future for all of us. Thank you.
Dean Henry, thank you very much for your remarks. We'll start a conversation. Some questions have already come in. But one striking question has already been posed, which is, it could be argued that, in fact, it is exactly policies of economic expansion and globalization that have actually created the global imbalances, that have actually created poverty in many of the countries that you've studied. And in fact, the question goes on to ask, it may even be the case that the story you just told about Mama and your mother are, in fact, the result of that. Comment on what creates poverty to begin with and the role that growth and expansion and global policies have to do with that.
Great. To address poverty, again, sustainably, the key thing is increasing economic efficiency. And the way in which countries have lifted in a sustainable way their systems out of poverty is by engaging in what's called catch-up growth, meaning that poor countries are poor largely because they have low productivity. And the way in which you raise your productivity is by, of course, educating your population, but also poor countries are poor because they don't have very much capital. So savings and the international allocation of savings plays a key role. So countries, of course, can save themselves and put aside resources to invest in factories, equipment, technology. But by allowing capital to come into the country from the outside, whether in the form of foreign direct investment or in the case of foreign portfolio investment, we can speed up the process of catch-up. And so as countries get more capital, as they accumulate capital, and as new opportunities for work are created, largely in many cases in China, for instance, in the manufacturing sector, you get a migration of labor from low productivity sectors of the economy into higher productivity sectors of the economy. And we begin a process of what's called catch-up growth. Now it's true there has to be, a balance has to be struck. And let me give you a very specific example in the context of international capital flows. What does discipline mean in the context of international capital flows? Well, too much debt and not enough equity is a critical problem. In fact, McKinsey Global Institute has just put out a very important study showing that international capital flows, even though they have bounced back since the crisis, are still not at the level they were in 2007. And they're really one of the key lessons, both in that report and, if I can modestly say, also in turnaround, that we learn from the 1982 third world debt crisis, the mid-1990s emerging markets debt crises, and frankly, the first world debt crisis in 2008, whether it's banks not having enough capital or the incentives in the international financial system being such that they encourage emerging markets to borrow long-term short-term dollar-denominated debt. That's the key weakness. And so there needs to be a balance. But capital flows can play a critical role in driving catch-up growth.
One of the things that's quite striking is that many of the countries around the world, while the economic policy and direction may be clear in terms of what countries need to do, the political realities in almost all of these countries is very, very different. In fact, a couple of questions here about what is the role of the political system in driving prosperity and growth. It may be a lot easier to have the discipline you're talking about when you've got an autocratic state. How does this work in a democracy, which may or not be a functional or dysfunctional democracy? So comment on the role of the political environment and context
Yes.
in the policies you're recommending.
Political economy is an important part of the story here. And it's certainly true that democracy, in many ways, has its own merits. The ease of getting through policy changes is not necessarily one of them. But the great news is, and this is really, I think, really hopeful news, there are examples of large heterogeneous democracies that have been able to move forward. Brazil is one example. I think if you were to look at Brazil in the late 1980s, and even as late as 1992, you would have been very unhopeful about the prospects for turnaround. But in a democratically elected society, under the leadership of Fernando Henrique Cardoso and subsequently Lula, Brazil was able to stop hyperinflation in its tracks, open its economy to greater flows of goods and capital, and turn itself around. So there are lots of examples of autocracies that have also generated greater prosperity. But as somebody who believes in democracy and thinks democracy is good for its own sake, I'm encouraged by the fact that there have been significant turnarounds. And one example I think it's interesting to look at, it's a fledgling democracy. Indonesia in 1997 had a terrible fallout from the financial crisis. GDP fell by almost double digits and was an autocratic society under Suharto. Indonesia is now a fledgling democracy that's doing a very respectable job of managing its natural resource wealth. So that, I think there are some examples of democracies that give us hope that democracy can actually deliver prosperity.
Which specific developing nations offer lessons for developed economies? And there are a couple of questions that point to specific countries. So some people are answering the questions of, are there lessons from countries like Ghana? What do we learn from countries like Venezuela? What do we learn from countries like China?
So let me pick a couple of take one of those countries and then add one of my own. So Ghana is an example that I left out that I should have included. Ghana is another example of that should give us hope, particularly in an African context. It's not as well known as it should be, but Africa is having its best decade of growth in a very long time, and Ghana has now had 2 successful democratic transitions in tightly contested elections, and continues to follow economic policies that are not producing miracle growth, but are producing stability. Stability is a key foundation for future growth. So it remains to be seen just how well Ghana will manage its newly found oil wealth. But again, I'm hopeful. I think South Korea is a country that we can learn a lot from. So I talked about trade policy. We often make the mistake of falling into what I call and others call the trade trap, which is the mindset that trade is good if it allows us to export a lot and import a little and run big trade surpluses. That's sort of mercantilist thinking that really has no place in a disciplined economic policy framework. South Korea is a great example of this. Between 1965 and 1990, South Korea grew at 7.1% per year, GDP per capita. That's more than 3 times as fast as the United States grew during its golden period of growth post-World War II. During that entire period, South Korea ran trade deficits. Imports and exports are key to growth. And going back to the earlier question about what generates prosperity, the reason why trade generates prosperity is that it allows a country to use its scarce capital and labor most effectively. It allows countries to import things that they can't produce very cost effectively. And for a country like South Korea, it allows it to produce for a large global market. So South Korea, even before it had local color television, it was producing color television broadcasting, it was producing color televisions for the rest of the world. Korea learned to export by importing. So important lessons there for developed nations.
There are a set of questions that are trying to challenge your premises to begin with. And let me ask 2 separate questions. One is, can you reconcile the idea of growth, especially consumption-fueled growth, as the answer to prosperity, particularly in a world in which there's now a scarcity of resources, population growth? So that's one part of the question. Another question challenging your premises is, in your book, you mentioned that the answer to understanding poverty, what works for poverty reduction, turns out to be the stock market. Can you explain those 2 things?
Yes. So on the question of consumption, there's no question that we need a rebalancing of the world economy. What do I mean by that? When people talk about global imbalances, what they mean is that there are some countries in which consumption is very high and savings is very low, and other countries, China in particular, which savings is very high and consumption is very low. And one might argue that these global imbalances in some ways may have contributed to the crisis. So the key point is that in order to achieve rebalancing, we need better policies. We need better policies. We need policies that encourage savings and investment in advanced nations. And as I said, there's much work that's left to be done in emerging nations as well. So countries like China in particular are focused on how do they create an environment in which their citizens have the confidence in the future so that they reduce their savings, their precautionary savings, and consume more and move to a more balanced growth path. So we need a balance. So discipline in the context of savings and investment and consumption means finding the balance so that you're not just a savings economy, but in which you're generating prosperity for your citizens and allowing them to consume some of that current prosperity, not just saving for the future.
I think part of what the question was trying to get at, I may have paraphrased it incorrectly, but how do you think about growth when we've got population growth, limited resources, and scarcity? Can economies continue to grow endlessly?
So one of the great observations of macroeconomics of modern data is that technological change is the key thing that alleviates the scarcity of resources. Through the new ideas, through innovation, finding new ways to combine scarce capital and labor allows us to make the most of our resources. And that's why efficiency is so critical. We need countries to do what's efficient, to generate more resources, to deal with all of the challenges that we face. And the second question was about, I forget now.
Well, somebody remarked that in your book you state that the best answer to understand poverty reduction comes from lessons in the stock market.
So it's ironic. Why the stock market? If we ask someone, let's take the example of the Washington Consensus, which created a firestorm of criticism. Is the Washington Consensus helpful or harmful? You'll get very different answers depending on whether you talk to somebody who's on the proverbial left or on the right. I'll give some specific examples. So Joe Stiglitz, who's been very critical of the Washington Consensus, will tell you that the Washington Consensus was a failure. If you talk to another economist, Ann Kruger, former first deputy managing director of the IMF, she will tell you that largely where countries were not successful, it was because they didn't go far enough in implementing Washington Consensus policy reforms. And so the question is, what should the average person think? Who's right? The person on the left or the person on the right? And I argue in the book is that we don't have to rely on people's opinions. We have facts. Let's look at how stock markets in developing countries have responded when countries have implemented specific policy reforms. Why the stock market? The stock market is forward-looking. The stock market doesn't care about economic ideology. The stock market cares about whether policy changes, on average, are going to create or destroy value by creating higher growth in the future and reducing uncertainty. And so the stock market is a good place to begin it's not a place to end a conversation, because very importantly, if a country implements, let's say, a reduction, a policy to reduce inflation and high inflation. So again, think of Latin America in the 1980s and 1990s. Policies that reduce high inflation cause the stock market to rise dramatically in value because uncertainty is reduced and expected future growth is higher. But the question then becomes, what else needs to happen? So the reduction of inflation is a necessary but not sufficient condition for shared prosperity. It's necessary because you need stability. You need to get rid of high inflation so that businesses can plan for the future, so that the poor don't have their meager savings wiped out as inflation undercuts their purchasing power. But then you also then need to have other policy changes. So for instance, businesses will want to invest as the stock market rises and the cost of capital falls. But are there government policies in place that make it easy for firms to hire and fire workers so that they're encouraged to hire workers, so that we get employment and job creation and higher wages? And just one specific example, the answer is yes, we do see that. So in the context of, in particular, when countries open their stock markets to foreign investment, when they open their stock markets to foreign investment in the late 1980s and early 1990s, what we see is not only does the stock market go up in value as the cost of capital is reduced because countries now are able to access the global capital market, but firms begin to invest in property, plant, and equipment, and wages actually rise dramatically. Wages go up by about 25% in real dollar terms over a 5-year window as a result of opening up. So the stock market is a place to begin. The stock market tells us whether the necessary conditions are in place for stability, for investment in the future. But then it's up to leaders to implement the other changes that are necessary to create broader prosperity.
How important are South-to-South flows in driving growth and prosperity for developing countries? And could you also comment on the implications of the growth in South-to-South flows for countries like the United States and other advanced economies?
Yeah. So South-to-South or emerging market to emerging market flows are increasingly important. And we should expect that because these are growing economies and they're taking on a larger and larger role. I would just say that it's very important to understand that even though emerging markets are driving global growth, growth is not a zero-sum game. So the rise of emerging markets, the rise of south-to-south financial flows and flows of goods and services means greater prosperity for them, but greater prosperity for them is also good for the first world as well. Why? Because a rising middle class in the emerging world means greater demand for all kinds of goods and services from the advanced nations as well. And again, that is the reason why we all need to follow disciplined policies.
Should we still be talking about and using labels like third world and first world?
Good question. So I was actually very intentional about using the phrase third world in this book. I really wanted to make the point that there was a turnaround, because there was a point in time when, if you go back even to Secretary Baker's speech, it refers very specifically to third world countries. And it just draws a stark contrast between what was, what is now, and what can be. And so if these countries that, as you allude to, or as the question alludes to, I should say, these formerly third world countries can turn themselves around and transform themselves and become emerging markets, then certainly there's a great possibility for all of us in the advanced nations. I'll refrain from using the first world in that context. The advanced nations to learn, if only we'll have the humility to go back and look at history and say, gee, we taught these lessons. Now it's time for us to take a seat and learn from these countries that have turned themselves around.
Bringing things closer to home, first of all, how would you contrast the success that Europe, countries like the United Kingdom, are having in addressing some of their challenges and to growth and prosperity? Similarly, how would you comment on the U.S.'s current efforts to restart the economy and improve and drive growth and prosperity?
So I don't see a lot of success in the United Kingdom, frankly. And I think it gets to the point about what does discipline mean. So the UK has taken a view that discipline means austerity. And I think they're finding that that austerity in a context of low inflation and slow demand is just as indisciplined as, frankly, as going on a spending binge in an overheating economy. Similarly, in the United States, I made the point about clarity earlier. I think there's a distinct lack of clarity at the moment, and it's not just the United States, but it's also Europe as well. Let me give you a very specific example. So in the United States, the Federal Reserve has taken a very aggressive stance on monetary policy, and I think an appropriate stance given the deflationary effects of financial crisis. But on the one hand, we have expansionary monetary policy and contractionary fiscal policy. So we're working at cross purposes. And if you look at Europe, it's the same thing. You have outright monetary transactions. Again, I think an appropriate stance by the European Central Bank. But you have Germany pushing austerity, trying to remake Europe in its own image. And so I think we need more reform and less austerity.
And what is the role of the various institutions that play into all of these things that affect prosperity? So you talked about the IMF, the World Bank. You've talked about the role of, at least others have talked about the role of aid. You've talked about the role of fiscal and monetary policy. So how important are all these different actors, if you like, in driving prosperity? And somebody's also asking a question about the role of the private sector in improving prosperity. Could you comment on that?
Yes, delighted to. So let me take it in two parts. Let me talk about international policy in a general growth context, and let me talk a little bit about aid as well. So tone and message matter quite a bit, as anybody who's been involved in leadership knows. And the tone that the International Monetary Fund, in particular, sets about global economic policy is of tremendous importance, particularly in the developing world. And what I would like to see, and what I think we need, and I talk about this in some detail in the chapter called Austerity Now, ? In Turnaround, is more clarity about the fund's view on fiscal policy. So if you look at what happened in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, the IMF took what was, I think, was a very appropriate stance, which was that it said the advanced nations of the world need to engage in fiscal stimulus. We need coordinated fiscal stimulus to keep the world economy from falling into a tailspin. But if you were an emerging economy, particularly in Asia in 1987, or one of the countries that had gone to the IMF throughout the 1980s or 1990s, that might have led you to scratch your head and say, well, gee, why is it that the IMF has recommended expansionary fiscal policy in the case of financial crisis in advanced nations, but fiscal austerity when it comes to us? The answer is that when you have a group of large countries all suffering from the same problem, you can't have them all pursuing austerity, because that would have driven the world into a tailspin. But given the evidence that I mentioned earlier about the impact of austerity in non-inflationary environments, I think there's room, and the IMF itself has acknowledged this, for discussion about what I would call not changing the ultimate goal, which is bringing about sustainable public finances, but what is the appropriate speed with which you move to balanced budgets. And that's the debate that the IMF is pushing in Europe right now, moving away from, for instance, the fiscal compact that Germany's pushing so hard to have balanced budgets by 2014. But I think there needs to be a clearer communication with its emerging market constituents about why it's taking this more temperate approach, and a real discussion about whether that might be appropriate in emerging market context. So coming to the question of, do I have time to talk about aid?
You did.
So Chapter 9 talks about debt relief and aid. So very quickly to come to the point, the heavily indebted poor countries of the world received debt relief under the Glen Eagles Initiative that was initiated in, I believe, 2005. The debt relief that the highly indebted poor countries of the world are receiving under, in the aftermath of that initiative, pales in comparison to the 0.7% of GDP that the advanced nations have pledged to poor countries over and over again. So the central message of the book on that topic is, if you think that aid does some good in the world, and there's some evidence that aid can actually produce some good in the world. And as a footnote, I should say a lot of the research that shows that aid hasn't produced growth, you shouldn't be surprised that aid hasn't produced growth, because much of the aid that's been given over the past 30, 40 years was never really designed to generate economic growth in the first place. But so there's some encouraging evidence now that aid given on a smaller scale can do some good. But if you believe that aid is part of the solution, then you should be very skeptical about the recent debt relief efforts, because it's largely a distraction from the issue, which is of whether we're actually increasing resource flows to the world's poorest countries. And the short answer is that debt relief hasn't increased the overall net resource flows. And the reason why is that as we've given debt relief with one hand, we've reduced aid flows on the other.
Peter, you made comments earlier that one of the third pillars of your argument is the importance of trust. So there's several questions that relate to trust. So first of all, how can people have more trust that countries like the United States are in fact interested in prosperity for all globally? And then secondarily, how can we help ensure that there's a sense that the U.S. is interested in prosperity for all locally, even within the United States? So are there things about building transparency? What would you recommend about getting to a place where we have more transparency and trust in trying to drive prosperity for all?
I think it's important that we have a more honest conversation. And more honest conversation, and a conversation that begins, frankly, with commonality as opposed to difference. So I think that most reasonable people will agree that greater growth, more prosperity is something that we all want. And if we can begin with the conversation there, as opposed to beginning the conversation with, I mentioned earlier, particular ideological positions, whatever issue you want to talk about, then I think we have a chance of finding compromise that can move us forward. I think an important part of what needs to happen in the conversation, and one of the reasons frankly why I wrote the book, is that yes, leaders need to understand the importance of efficiency, but just as important, I think the electorate, citizens, need to understand. And if we don't hold our leaders accountable to a higher standard, then we're to blame as well. So I think there's so again, in the same way in which there needs to be a two-way conversation about future prosperity between the emerging world and the advanced nations, there also needs to be within countries, to your point, to the question, there needs to be a conversation about between the electorate, a new conversation between the electorate and the elected, with the electorate, frankly, holding leaders to a higher standard.
Earlier in your remarks, you commented and you linked prosperity to jobs and employment. You also talked a lot about the role of productivity. Mm-hmm. Can you comment on what your outlook is on jobs and employment, particularly in advanced economies, since that seems to be part of an important element of driving prosperity?
Yeah. So the critical point here is what is the relationship between what's called actual growth and the trend rate of growth. So the trend rate of growth in the United States historically has been about 2.7, 2.8%. In Europe, it's slightly lower. It's probably closer to something like 2.2%. And the critical point is, if you go back to the 2012 numbers, 1.3% growth in advanced nations, roughly 2.2% in the United States, negative growth in Europe. Those are growth rates that are below potential growth. And so there's something called Oakland's Law, which basically says if a country grows slower than its potential growth rate, it can't reduce unemployment. And so we need, in the short run, policies are going to, frankly, bring up the actual rate of growth. So we need, frankly, less austerity. But yes, in order for that growth to be sustainable, in order for job creation, which will come once we start growing above trend, to be sustainable, we need more focus on reform that will produce the kinds of productivity gains. I mentioned earlier, reducing the cost of doing business is critical in a European context. Addressing issues of health and education and infrastructure in the United States are critical. So in the short run, less austerity. We need to get actual growth rate up so that we can produce jobs and reduce unemployment. But in order for that growth to be sustainable, we need productivity enhancing reforms.
And on that note, if you were to be called to testify in Congress or to sit down with the president, what specifically would you recommend?
I think the most important thing the U.S. can do to ensure a prosperous decade is to find a way to pass some disciplined legislation that, and I mean discipline in the sense of which I refer to discipline in the book, that gets us on a long-term sustainable path on fiscal policy that reduces the deficit gradually over time through some combination of spending cuts and tax increases that everyone knows needs to happen, that puts in place a broad change in the tax structure that is pro-growth.
And then perhaps as a final question, are we looking forward enough on these things? Several people are asking about the role of innovation, the role of technology. Is technology and innovation far ahead of what policymakers are thinking about? How can we harness the power of technology and innovation?
Innovation is, and the role of technology and the role of idea generation is one of the reasons why we should all be particularly hopeful, I think. And I think we make a mistake not to be forward-looking and not to continue to invest in the future, in particular in education. And let me make this point. There's a lot of talk about income inequality in the United States, and that's appropriate. But the most effective way to address income inequality in the United States and more generally in advanced nations is to increase the number of skilled workers in the workforce. By increasing the number of skilled workers in the workforce, you increase the supply of skilled workers, which reduces what's called the skill premium, the gap between the wages of the skilled and the unskilled. But it also increases the number of people who are earning high incomes. And that precisely to the point of the question, requires investment in the future, investment in educating workers who can play a significant role in the knowledge economy.
And on that particular note, are there particular either policy or technology innovations that you are particularly excited about, that you've seen?
I think that, as an educator, the role of technology in helping us do new and exciting things, even as we figure out exactly what those things should be, in delivering education, a high-quality education to larger numbers of people in a cost-effective way, I think is one of the most exciting things in the 21st century.
To do justice to a couple other questions and areas that we didn't cover, let me try and see if we can squeeze this in. A couple of people are asking about, you haven't mentioned climate change in any of your remarks. You haven't really commented on population growth. You haven't commented much on income inequality. Can you speak to those three things?
Yes. So I just spoke a little bit about income inequality. So let me just briefly talk about climate change and population growth. I don't have much specific to say about these issues in the book. They're critically important issues. But I felt it was paramount in turnaround to create a focus on the role that efficient economic policies can play in raising productivity in all countries to increase the resources that we have to deal with all of these pressing problems of climate change and population growth. Because as I read in that passage about Miss Mama, if we can make better use of our scarce resources, we can move away from a conversation about zero-sum trade-offs of distribution and have more resources to deal with all the problems facing society.
And income inequality?
Yeah, so on income inequality, I think the key there is the way to address income inequality most effectively and most sustainably is through education. And I think we make a mistake when we polarize our populations and focus the income inequality discussion. And there's clearly a role for a progressive tax system. We want a progressive tax system. I believe in that. But we make a mistake in conflating progressive taxation with a fundamental need to invest in our future and invest in producing more skilled workers.
But how would you address that specifically in the context of the United States? Is this a legitimate debate for us to be having, and how would you tackle the question of income inequality?
Yeah. So what I would say is the following. So I'm going to be put on my economist hat even more firmly here. Every society, so whether it's the United States or Western Europe or South Africa, every polity has to have that conversation about what they want their society to look like, what they want to achieve in terms of what they think is fair. And the question of what is fair is something that societies have to determine in the body politic, based on values, based on culture, based on a range of things that differ from country to country. The role that economics has to play in that debate is, given what a society says it wants to achieve, what's the most efficient way of achieving that outcome? And I think it's a critical lesson, again, from history. Again, the history of looking at economic reform. Jamaica is a great example. In the early 1970s, a charismatic leader by the name of Michael Manley came to power in Jamaica, wanting to desperately address issues of income inequality and lack of access. But by failing to recognize that you can't uplift the masses by undercutting the productive side of society, whether businesses and investment, put that country into a terrible economic tailspin. So income inequality is an important issue, but we have to remember that in order to address income inequality in a sustainable way, we need more productive, more efficient economies.
On that note, I'd like to thank Pete Henry for taking the time to speak to us, and join me in thanking Pete Henry for his time.
Thank you, James. Thank you.